Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first lunchtime talk organized by the ESG division of the GSSA. My name is Masibulele. For the talk, you can refer to me as Masi. I am the Vice President of Branches and Divisions of the GSSA, and today I'm standing in for the Chairperson of the ESG division, who is traveling out of the country, and as a result requested that I stand in support for our very first formal talk. The ESG division is one of our newest divisions that was formed recently to cater for the growing need and representation of events and activities within the environmental, social, and governance space. And as a result, we have our first speaker, Dr. John Kilani. He's joining us from Qatar. Allow him to talk in a minute, but just a little bit about Dr. Kilani. He's with the Abdullah bin Hamad Al Tia International Foundation for Energy and Sustainable Development as the director. He joined them in 2016. He holds a PhD in civil engineering from University of Birmingham. He was previously the Director for Sustainable Development Mechanisms at the United Nations Framework Convention and Climate Change. Before that, he also worked for entities like Anglo Val Mining here in South Africa as a senior executive for safety, health, and environment. And I probably can spend half the talk elaborating on the resume of Dr. Kilani. But without further ado, I will allow and set the ball rolling. Dr. Kilani, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mercy, for your warm introduction. And I would like to begin by thanking GSSA as well as Exponential Mining Services for inviting me for this talk. I welcome all of you for joining this talk, and I'm really looking forward to it. I hope we'll be able to have a very warm discussion among ourselves. Let me just try and share my screen. Well, can you all see it? Sorry, Mercy,
yes,
can you see?
Yeah, yes, we can see your screen, Dr. Kilani.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Just briefly, what I'm going to be doing by way of outline is that I'll start with a very brief opening remarks. And then, as the title of the talk says, we will look at what we currently know. I mean, what do we know as the main drivers of ESG? Then we will dive into why are we experiencing, or on what basis do we actually think that there is a growing momentum on ESG, and then we will look at what the future holds. And in between, in between the presentation, at various intervals, we've got 3 polling questions, which hopefully will help to engage the audience in the discussion. And I will let Mercy know at what point each of those polling questions should be posed. And I'm looking forward to your active participation in the polling. And let me say from the very start that for these questions, there is no right or wrong answer. The whole purpose of the polling questions will be to stimulate discussion and for us to be able to see what collectively as audience, what people think on this topic. So by way of opening remark, why is ESG a trending topic? I think there are 3 main reasons. And these 3 main reasons are already anchored in the topic that we are discussing. Anchored in E is the fact that we are experiencing a trending nature of this topic right now because there is urgency to address climate change. It's no longer a secret that the whole world is now seeing climate change as an urgent issue that needs to be addressed. And ESG is a trending topic because in the past 2.5 years, the silent S in the ESG has suddenly woken up, partly as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that this had on the whole global economy and the means that the whole world is using to try to address the impact of the pandemic has suddenly given an impetus to the S in the ESG. Also, there are other events. We all know about events that happened recently that highlighted racial inequality, gender inequality. And so all these things have suddenly put a lot of emphasis on the S. And thirdly, the reason why this topic continues to be on the trending move is because the pressure on corporate governance will never go away. We continue to see much scrutiny on corporate governance issues, to the point that there are some activists now who makes it their role to buy sufficient shares in companies so that they can get a seat on the board and therefore have a say in which the companies are being governed. So now, with those 3 points in mind, just having that picture of how the E and the S and the G are moving, what are the main drivers? We are going to look now on what are the main drivers of ESG. What are the things that are actually driving this upward trend that we are witnessing? Number one is climate change. Before climate change becomes an issue of prominence, the E focus mainly on the environmental issues. But with what is happening now about climate change has actually taken a center stage in the consideration of the environmental aspect of ESG. All the other environmental issues have not gone away, but climate change has really taken the front part. And why? Why is climate change making this push for ESG? Why is climate change a major driver now of the environmental aspect of ESG? I'll just make 4 points to show you why suddenly climate change has become a household name and something to reckon with when you are thinking about ESG. The first point is that climate change is a serious global threat. Before, there are arguments on both sides, those who don't believe in it and those who believe in it. We all know what happened during the Trump era, but there is no denying the fact now that in general, climate change is now considered as a serious global threat. The quality and volume of evidence describing that threat is overwhelming. And with it, public support for effective global action is increasing. And we see this increasing trend beginning right from the end of 2015, in December 2015, when world leaders successfully negotiated and agreed on an international response to climate change in what we all know and what is now commonly known as the Paris Climate Agreement. In fact, many people now see the Paris Agreement as the last hope for the world to be able to address the challenges of climate change. We tried with the Kyoto Protocol. It was not as successful as it was intended, but lessons were learned from it. And an attempt to replace the Kyoto Protocol in Copenhagen in 2009 didn't succeed. But finally, after a 5-year painstaking diplomacy and international negotiation, the Paris Agreement was agreed and adopted in December 2015 in Paris. When you think about Paris Agreement, most people think it's an event that happened in December 2015. But those of us that were right in the heart of it knew that it took us 5 years of serious work to be able to reach what was agreed in 2015. And as a result of the Paris Agreement, many countries are now committing to ambitious target of net zero emissions by around 2050. Different countries have set different target dates to achieve net zero, but most countries have set the target date of 2050. I will explain later why this is important and why should continue, why this will continue to shape what we expect to see in future with regards to ESG. But it is important to know that many countries and also many companies are announcing publicly their commitment to net zero emission target with setting different dates to achieve this. Corporate social responsibility anchored on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is another driver for ESG. Many companies are committed to corporate social responsibility in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But the pandemic, coronavirus pandemic, has brought into sharper focus why effort to take collective action in addressing sustainable development goals, which incidentally were adopted the same year as the Paris Agreement. And when you look at the chapter of the Paris Agreement, you will see that it emphasizes that actions on climate change has to go hand in hand with countries' responsibility to develop, countries' commitment to the goal. The 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in September 2015, and the Paris Agreement in December. So it is not an accident. It was not just mere coincidence that these two important international treaties were adopted in the same year within just a few months apart. Government policies and regulations are going to continue to be a driving force for ESG. So as government commits to climate change, to addressing climate change, and to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we will expect that there is going to be more and more stringent policies and more regulations. But the good news is that many countries that are already signaling their policies at the moment are committed to using a carrot and stick approach. So that should be good news for the private sector. And also more importantly is the investment trends that we are seeing as a driver. We'll see more details of this as we go ahead. We will see some examples of what the trend in investment is that is given more focus now and more interest on ESG principles and ESG factors. They are becoming very prominent now in investment decision making. And the final bullet I have here on the list as part of the drivers is the fact that there is now a very strong business case for ESG. ESG should not only be viewed anymore, it's not only seen anymore as a nice to have, but it's something that actually now have a very strong business case. Profitability of businesses now depends on how committed to ESG they are. So if any business wants to be competitive globally, it has no choice but to take ESG seriously. So business profitability and competitiveness is a major driver of ESG. And like I said earlier, this graph just shows you examples of countries that are committed. These are just few. I'll give more details of this later when we are looking at what lies ahead. And also, this shows us the example of private companies that are committed, ranging from the IT sector, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, to energy companies like Shell, BP, Equinor, Total, and others, airlines, every sector of every part of the private sector is now fully committed to ESG, particularly to setting net zero targets as far as their climate change ambition is concerned. But we will see some statistics on this as we move on. Now, on what basis can we say that, yes, there is a growing momentum on ESG? And this is where some statistics is going to be very, very helpful. On what basis? What are the facts on which we can base our position that ESG is gaining momentum and is going to continue to gain momentum? First, there is now a growing support for ESG principles. More and more companies and more policymakers are supporting principles that are embedded in ESG. I'll just give you one example. The United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, the PRI, was launched in 2006. And these principles encourage signatories, that is, asset owners, asset managers, and service providers that are willing to sign to this UN set of principles to incorporate ESG factors into their investment decision-making processes. Since 2006, when these principles were launched, the number of signatories to the PRI globally has grown from less than 100 in 2006 to over 2,400 in 2019 and still rising. It is now well over 3,000 currently in 2022, and the number is still rising. So these principles launched in 2006 with just 100 signatories is grown in proportion. The Global Sustainability Investment Alliance estimates that at the end of 2018, assets invested using sustainability approaches totaled over $30 trillion. That is at the end of 2018. Between 2018 and 2019, sustainably managed assets in the US alone, out of these $30 trillion, the proportion from the US alone in 1 year, 2018 to 2019, has grown more than 42%. That is a phenomenal growth. And with that type of statistics, I think one would not be making a mistake to say that this is an issue that is growing in momentum. Investing in ESG was estimated to be worth $30 trillion in 2018, like I said, with projections that are now running up to $50 trillion over the next 20 years. So a $30 trillion investment in 2018 is now projected globally to rise to $50 trillion in the next 20 years. So which means in the next 20 years, it will have risen by 2/3, getting close to doubling. And that is a phenomenal growth. And then just one more statistics to just show why this is a growing momentum. The number of companies that are voluntarily publishing annual sustainability or ESG reports has grown significantly in recent years, with over 80% of companies in the S&P 500 now publishing these reports by 2020. By 2020, more than 80% of listed companies in S&P 500, more than 80% of S&P 500 companies are reporting annually, submitting ESG annual report. And these ESG reports are following lay down global international standards of reporting, because these companies know that these reports are now open to public scrutiny. So this indeed is a growing trend. And therefore, if this is growing, what should we be expecting? What should we expect in the future? What awaits us in the future? So because this trend is growing, does that mean that it's reached its peak and is going to stop? Or what still lies ahead? And what I have done here is I would like to give you a little indication of what lies ahead. And before we do that, I would like to ask Mercy if you can just show the first polling question.
See, I'll try and launch the poll from here.
Okay. Do I have to stop my screen share?
No,
Okay.
you're perfectly fine.
Yeah. So
I think it's already been launched.
Yeah, thank you. So can everybody see the question? So I would really encourage you to respond. As you read the question, just choose which answer you. Okay, we have 83% of the audience have participated, which I think is a very good number. Thank you for your participation. And as you can see from the responses, most of you, more than 55%, about 55%, more than half of the participants that currently stand at 91%. If I end the poll, will you be able to still show the result? Or I leave it while I comment on it?
Better leave it while you comment on it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Craig. So 55% say all of the above. And that is exactly what I was expecting. Because it is becoming difficult for us to separate any of these drivers, because the drivers are intertwined. Remember what I said at the beginning. It is not a coincidence that the 70 UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Change Accord were adopted. In fact, the processes, the UN CSD process and the UN climate change process that were leading to those two international treaties, they were happening side by side. And the participants, the government negotiators in these processes were well interlinked. So most governments use the same delegations or very similar delegations to negotiate this agreement. So therefore, it is not surprising that most of us participating in this discussion this afternoon see all of the above drivers continue to drive. And then next to that is the business profitability and competitiveness, which is 18%, which again should not come as a surprise. I don't believe that the challenges that the world is facing can be addressed through charity. You need business commitment, you need private sector commitment, and only if the private sector is fully committed into what needs to be done will it happen. Therefore, we should, and that is the beauty of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a paradigm shift from the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol, you can say, is a name and blame kind of treaty that tries to see the private sector as the culprit, whereas the Paris Agreement is very collaboratory. Everybody needs to be involved if we are going to be able to solve the problem of climate change. And for the private sector to be involved, it has to make business sense. And it cannot be just purely on charity. And therefore, if anybody from the private sector is participating in this discussion. Pay close attention to the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which has to do with carbon market, because this article is aimed at unlocking the potential that is available within the private sector to inventivize, to create an incentive, to incentivize the private sector to be serious about climate action. Okay, so let's now look at what lies ahead. And what I want to do in this, which is the last end of our, okay, we can stop sharing the result of the polling question 1 now. Yeah. So what I want to do now is, if we look at what lies ahead, I wanted here again to just show some stats for us to see what is happening. Because for you to be able to know what is ahead of you, you need to know what is currently happening. What are people doing that is dictating what is going to happen in the future? So let me just flag some statistics that we already know about what is happening. Currently, we have more than 85 countries accounting for about 75% of global GHG emissions that have communicated publicly their net zero emission target. And there are now more than 1,500 large corporations with net zero carbon emission pledges. And these 1,500 large corporations that have announced their net zero carbon emission pledges includes one quarter of them is from the S&P 500. 25% of S&P 500 companies have now publicly set net zero target. The Portfolio Decarbonization Coalition, a United Nations-sponsored group of 27 institutional investors and asset managers controlling $3.2 trillion in assets, has committed, they've just recently committed $600 billion to fund green projects. So there are funds being committed out there for green projects. The European Commission proposed 750 billion euro fund, the proposed 750 euro fund by the EU to help the EU bloc, to help the Commission recover from COVID-19 pandemic, came with a requirement. There is a requirement attached to this fund, and that requirement is that 25% of that 750 billion euro will be set aside for climate change mitigation. So yes, the EU has recognized that yes, COVID had a negative impact on the economy, and a lot of effort is required for recovery, and set up that fund and committed that amount of money, but they decided that 25% of that money will be to address climate change. One example of outside the climate change, because if you look at the first bullet of what lies ahead, it says all the key drivers, just as our poll question showed, will continue to drive climate change. Therefore, we shouldn't expect them to go down. Just an example to show you how the S in the ESG is also moving forward and will not go away, because I don't want at the end of this discussion, this presentation, for you to think, oh, I'm just focusing on climate change. The S, like we said, has been silent for some time, but has suddenly woken up. And an example, a statistic that will show you how this has happened is many corporate private sector companies now are paying closer and increasing attention to social issues. And one example that shows that this is what is happening, one example that illustrates this is reliable evidence that gender diversity improves results is now well documented. There is well documentation of evidence, of very reliable evidence that gender diversity improves company results. As an example, the S&P Quantamental Research Team found that from 2002 to 2019, they did a research that covers 2002 to 2019. They found that companies with female chief financial officers generate 1.8 trillion US$ more in gross profit in their sector when compared to companies that have male CFOs. This is just one example to show you that paying attention to social issues such as gender diversity is actually contributing to companies making profit. ESG will continue to be fully integrated into core business decisions and become significant issue in board level conversations. Increasing commitment to ESG reporting, just like we saw example of how many 80% companies now reporting, that trend is going to increase. And it's not going to be limited to big corporations anymore, but even medium and small size enterprises will begin to see the benefit of ESG reporting. And I would like us to quickly run to quickly have the second polling question. You have the second polling questions displayed now, and it would be nice to have your response. In your perspective, which of the components of ESG, is it the E or the S or the G that you think will continue to be dominant as we move forward, or all the three? With 61%, because of our time, and I would like us to have some time to really have some discussion, to have your contribution. Also, about 76% now has responded, and the response shows again that we all, majority of us believe that all three will receive equal attention. And even those who specify individual components, you see that both environment, social, and corporate governance actually receive very similar percentages. So 18%, 18%, 15, 17% is moving, now 15% altogether for each, voting for each, and again 54%, more than half of us, believing that all three will receive equal attention. Maybe the word equal there may be confusing. The equal is not meant to indicate quantitative equality. It means that not ignored. None of those three can be ignored anymore. They will all be given the attention that they deserve. So that was what that essence of equal attention is meant to indicate. It doesn't mean that companies will be expected to vote equal amount of money, equal amount of time, and so on each. But I think the trend we are seeing right now, that each of those three components we gain prominence that they deserve. We are moving into an era when none of those components will be seen a second fiddle to the other. So if we can just proceed then to, let's proceed then to the third. Let's proceed to the third poll question. Can we have the poll question quickly before I close?
Just launched.
Yeah, thank you. The third poll question is launched, and this is just for you to just indicate your understanding of where ESG is right now. So you have a list of statements, and what is expected of you just to indicate which of these statements that you agree with the most. It's as simple as that. And like I said at the beginning, there's no right or wrong answer with this statement. It's just to, this last poll question is just to make sure that you are listening to the presentation, and while you are listening, you are forming your opinion on ESG. Let's just give 1 more minute for people to respond. 71%, 78% right now, and then once it hit 80, then we proceed. Okay, we see that interestingly, nobody believes that ESG framework provides a strong basis for companies to a strong basis for companies to achieve long-term value creation. That is interesting, and something that I think we need to look more into, especially if we believe that there is a strong case for a strong business case for ESG. I think we have anybody that is serious about commitment to ESG or providing guidelines, even policymakers that are thinking of policies that we encourage ESG. I think that last statement is something that we require to be looked at seriously, because if ESG framework don't provide a strong basis for companies to achieve long-term value creation, then it will not be anchored in a strong foundation that is required. Otherwise, there is no right or wrong statement. This is just an indication of our various views at the moment on ESG, as demonstrated by those statements. So if we continue now with the last part of my presentation, before my concluding remark, I just thought I will use this slide to just explain, in case you have been wondering what is net zero, because I know net zero has been spoken of so much and we see it a lot in literature, but it seems to mean different things to different people, and some of the interpretations of net zero honestly are not correct. So I just thought I should put this slide to explain the concept of net zero. And more importantly, the reason for putting this slide there is to show that commitment to net zero, growing commitment to net zero, is also pushing for ESG. Is also an indication or a reflection of what we should expect as we go into the future. That is why I just threw in this slide there. So if you look at this slide, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Marcy, can you see my cursor?
Yes, Dr. Kilani, you can see it.
Okay, good. So if you look at this, basically, what the Paris Agreement is that countries came together and agreed and said they will not allow temperature rise to go beyond 2 degrees, to go above 2 degrees, compared to pre-industrial level by 2100. By the turn of this century, if the world is to survive the adverse effect of climate change, scientists, IPCC, body of evidence have shown that temperature rise should not go above 2 degrees. At the moment, so they came to that agreement 2015. And based on that agreement, each country was asked to submit their nationally contributed, their national action, what each country can contribute, their NDCs, nationally determined contribution. So which is different from the Kyoto, where a target was set and imposed on industrialized countries. Paris Agreement say, every country, look at your situation, decide what you can do. And the NDCs that were submitted showed that the world is currently on the 3.5 or 4 degrees temperature rise path. If the NDCs that are submitted right now are to be totaled and are to be achieved, the goal of the Paris Agreement will not be achieved. The world is on the path to about 4 degrees temperature rise. And what is even worse, despite the NDCs, emissions are growing. The business as usual emission is increasing. So not only is the ambition indicated in the nationally determined contributions are not enough, emissions are increasing. And therefore, there is a what do you call it? An emergency call. The emergency call now is we have to change course. If this trajectory does not bend in such a way that we reach net zero, that emissions, not that we achieve our emission reduction. It's not that we are going to achieve our emission reduction. If we don't bend the curve in such a way that emission is not increasing anymore to the point where by 2050, no more increase in emission, and that is net zero. If we don't achieve net zero by 2050, when there will be no more increase in emission, we need to forget ever achieving the goal of the Paris Agreement. So that is the whole concept of 2050. By 2050, we should collectively reach a stage where whatever is emitting to the atmosphere is counterbalanced by whatever is removed. Whatever is being emitted that cannot be mitigated, we have to find a way of offsetting the emissions. And there is where Article 6 of the Paris Agreement comes in. So if you want to discuss this further, maybe we will pick it up during the discussion. So by way of concluding, I want to thank you for listening to me this afternoon. I just want to say that ESG is now in the spotlight, and companies will ignore it at their own peril. If a company wants to remain competitive, you better pay attention to ESG. And what is very important, why ESG has been all about talk and laying various foundations through debates and policy development and policy formulation, we now believe that a lot of work has been done that will launch 2020 as a decade of action on ESG. So from now to the end of this decade, we expect to see more action on ESG more than just talk. So it is better, if that is what is going to happen, It is better for every organization, for every company to stay ahead of the game through proactive actions, because don't expect that countries are going to relax. What you should expect is that countries are going to enact and adopt more and more stringent legislation. Thank you very much. And I will now take your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kilani. If you have a question, please do it by raise of hand, and I will acknowledge, and then you can unmute yourself and fire away your question. Alternatively, you can post it in the chat. I can assist with that as well.
Dr. Kilani, one from me. Do you see ESG audits becoming a major portion of the major auditing companies' business model in the coming 10 or 20 years?
Thank you, Craig. Maybe we should take because of time, if we can take 1 or 2 or 3 questions, so then I respond. Otherwise, I'll respond to this. But if we have more questions, let's take 1 or 2 more, then I respond, then we go to the next.
Tim, do you want to unmute yourself and maybe share the one you put on the chat?
Tanya's hand is up.
Dr. Kilani, the question I have deals with the governance. How easy is it going to be to define what sort of governance falls within ESG exposure? Because the field of governance is extremely large and can become very complicated. So how are we going to be able to define which of the governance issues are the ones that we need to look at for ESG? Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya, for that question. Can we take 1 more, or should I respond to these 2 first?
Fire away, Tim.
Okay, Tim.
I put one in the chat. From a mining perspective, how does the definition of the S in ESG change when compared to the other sectors? Mining companies have a much larger responsibility placed on them in terms of the communities that they operate when compared to the other larger sectors that are brought in.
Thank you, Tim. That is a very good question. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Tim, for this good questions. And hopefully to be able to stimulate. So I'll just give, I don't see these questions as directed to me alone. So whatever I say in response to these questions, I would like us to see it as a discussion starter, and more people should feel free to contribute to the issue that have been raised by these questions. First of all, the question raised by Craig as to how significant ESG audits is going to be, how much is going to become part of ESG, or the way companies look at ESG. My answer is that yes, it is going to be very, very significant. The reason is because independent audits, independent review, especially of ESG reports, is going to be very key for ESG that is done by any company to have credibility. So if a company says, I'm doing this, it is very easy to say, I'm doing this. But if the company says, I'm doing this, and this has been verified by an independent body, that we have more credibility. So while now most effort is just to encourage the reporting, as we go into the future, the credibility of those reports, credibility of the actions being taken, credibility of the initiatives become more and more necessary to prove. And the only way you can prove it is through independent auditing. So yes, it's going to remain. It's going to be a growing aspect of ESG. And on the question of governance, how do we define what sort of governance issues to look into ESG? I agree with you, Tanya, that governance issues are very broad. But when we consider that the G in the ESG is about corporate governance, we are not talking about government regulation and government political governance or the way industries are regulated by the authorities. We are talking about the way companies in a way you can put it, the way companies regulate their business, how they operate. Whatever the input from government is just setting the framework and requirement and say, this is what we expect from you. But how internally companies regulate themselves is very critical, and therefore it's very easy to define. What makes it easy to define is that anything that makes a company to be a good corporate citizen should receive attention in its governance structure. For example, issues like transparency, gender equality. Even for example, when a company is deciding that, okay, we've taken a big hit from coronavirus, this is how we intend to recover from the impact of coronavirus. How is the decision being made on what that company considered to be critical in terms of how to address the concerns of the employees, how to address the concerns of the community within which they operate, whatever they are doing to make their operations recover, how is that extending to the wider community in a way that they believe that same community, by extending these interventions to them, the benefit will eventually come back to the company. So yes, this is a wide and broad area, but once you start considering the social aspect of ESG, the issues are actually very easy to define, because you are not just looking at governance issues exclusively removed from the E and the S. So long as you look at the governance issue from the perspective of the E and the S, it will be very, very easy for you to define them. And then on the third question about mining sector, I agree with you, Tim. This is very, very important. And in my view, I think the picture you just painted about the mining sector is not a challenge. It's actually an opportunity. I think the mining sector, the energy sector, they have bigger opportunities. They have wider opportunities to actually do a lot of social issues. So yes, the wider the impact the sector is having on the community, I believe that the bigger the opportunities. Yes, it could be challenging, but with the bigger challenge comes with bigger opportunities, and also it just gives wider scope to be able to evaluate various options that the mining companies want to engage in. And very important, crucial to all these three questions, all these three issues that this question raised, very crucial to them is the issue of collaboration and partnership with stakeholders. Stakeholders' involvement is very, very key, because if you want to show that you have a good governance, You need to demonstrate how much are you involving stakeholders in your decision making. And if you want to show how you are making good decisions in selecting ESG initiatives, how much are stakeholders involved in the identification of those initiatives? So any comment from anybody on these three good questions? I mean, it will be helpful. Does anyone want to comment on this question? Even if you are the one that asked the question and you want to elaborate on it, please feel free. Craig, Tim, and Tanya.
Yes, Tanya.
Dr. Kilani, do you have any ideas on how we might go about measuring the impact of particularly the S and the G factors when it comes to determining how well companies are doing? Is there a list of things that we ought to be considering, and how would we go about measuring those features? Thank you.
Thank you again. Very good question. You are right. E is very easy. E is becoming very easy to measure. I mean, you have many indicators for measuring environmental performance. And if you take climate change, it's very easy for you to set your emission target and then decide and then evaluate every year to see whether you are meeting those your target for reducing your carbon footprint. But the S and the G is the tricky one, like you've pointed out. Tricky one to measure, but they are not impossible to measure. So the starting point is that what you do is to set up for yourself measurable goals. And again, this is the beauty. I mean, because they are difficult to measure and because they are at a different level with the environment at the moment, with the E at the moment, you still have the leeway. Companies still have the leeway to set their own target by themselves. You don't have to have a target imposed on you. So set measurable targets. And once you've set those targets, those are the targets you are going to be measuring yourself against. And I think your question is saying, what are some of the areas or issues that one should consider in setting up those targets? Some of them are very commonly known now. I mean, a company that is serious about addressing the S in the G, like the example I gave, has to have a target for gender equality. We cannot operate anymore from the notion that we don't have competent females, and that is why we are not having enough females. We have to have a target for gender equality because competent females are out there. All it means is we just need to make effort to find them. And you need to set a target for stakeholder involvement in your decision-making body. For example, a company can say in the board of directors, we want to have this number of independent directors in the board. And once we decide we will have this number of independent number of directors, we want to even go further by indicating which constituency those independent directors represent. So those are some of the indicators you can use for setting your second target for yourself. And once you set those targets, then measuring them year to year becomes very easy. Another possible indicator is to set a target. Just like you know that addressing environmental issues cost money, set a target for initiatives, for projects that are focused on S. Training of your employees. I mean, whatever you intend to do, there has to be cost associated with it. So you need to set yourself a target to say, as a company, 1% of our pre-tax profit X% of it is earmarked for social and governance related issues of ESG. So those are some of the examples of practical, measurable targets that you can set. And once you set those targets, then measuring them periodically becomes easy.
I think in the interest of time and maybe adding to your comment here, Doctor, is a question from Nicole that says, from an investor perspective, how do we avoid the pitfalls of greenwashing? I'm not sure if you want to weigh in on that,
Yes.
but we're a little bit over time now.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe just briefly to respond to that, because that question is related to the last question that Tanya asked. And just to say that there are good international guidelines now available out there that you can use. So investors are not left, and companies that are also trying to set targets or measure their performance in terms of the S and the Gs are not left out there now to just beat about the bush. There are well-recognized guidelines that have been developed by independent international organizations that are available now for measuring best practices, either as an investor or as a private company.
Okay, thank you for those questions and those answers. Certainly learned a lot. And we've come to the end of our event and run out of time. Wish we could have had the whole day, I guess, of having the discussions. On behalf of the ESG division and GSSA, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Kilani, again for your time and such an informative talk. And obviously thank also XMS for sponsoring this event. Without your support, we wouldn't be where we are at the stage of the ESG division of the GSSA. And just as a final request from me, if we can please just as a request from the ESG division, switch on cameras so that they take a snip of their first ever event. Lovely. Now we can put some faces to some of the names and hope to see you in the next of our events. And please watch between the GSSA calendar and the ESG division itself. Most of the communications will be coming through, and we'd like to see you in the future ones as well. Thank you very much, and do enjoy your day. I see, Brett, you have more than one a number of people on your side, and thanks again for joining to everyone at your side.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Dr. Kilani. It was most interesting.